visit those mid-level areas, but for now I'm going to leave it alone and move on to the foreground of this little hare who's been waiting patiently this whole time for some attention. I am going to start with a little bit of buff titanium and a touch of quinacridone pink, and also a touch of ultramarine blue. Wow, that turned out a little bit more gray than I wanted. I don't want that. I want more purpley. Aha. That's a little bit more of a purpley gray. Okay. But I want more pink and more buff titanium. All right. Yes, that is where I want it to be. For this foreground stone area. And taking some of that greenish color that's in my palette already, and some of the red stuff. Like I said, I just mix whatever I've got on hand, which is why I rarely clean out my palette entirely, because I always find some use for the colors that are there. All right, now I want some granulation. So I'm dotting in some of the colors that I know are prone to giving me such results. I'm doing wet on wet. Whole mix of colors here. Now, you gotta be careful when mixing up bunches of colors like this. Okay, first of all, that is much too dark of a blue. I don't want that much blue. It's competing with the background. So I'm just going to dab that up. Unfortunate that that's going to get rid of any granulating that happened, but all right, now what was I saying? Oh yeah, mixing lots of different colors. The danger with that is that you end up with gray or tones that are far too neutral. In this case, I want it to be a neutrally, but sort of pinkish and sort of purplish color. And that's why I just mix things until it kind of gives me the results that I want. And the rabbit, I want him to be a little bit brighter. So I'm mixing buff titanium and yellow, just to give him a slightly brighter base tone to work from than the surrounding stuff here. Right. As you've no doubt already deduced over the course of this video, this is not traditional watercolor techniques. I am not bothering with transparency in any way. I mean, I'm using transparency, but I'm not fixating on that and limiting myself to it. I'm using opaque whites when I need it, as well as opaque other colors. Okay. Adding a little bit of tone to this area that I had to paint white over. And doing a bit more greenish wash in this area. You see, a lot of this, I'm not really planning much at all. It's just by feel. As I go, it feels like it needs a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, a little bit more green, a little bit more yellow, and I just go with instinct. What actually helps is the fact that I'm videotaping this. So I've got my camera here in front of my face, which at times is actually kind of annoying, but I've gotten used to it. But one of the things it's actually really useful for is that it puts a distance between me and the painting. I'm looking at the painting for the most part when I'm doing this, not at the camera screen, my phone screen. But when I do look at the phone screen, it's this small version of the painting in front of me, and it gives me a different perspective. It gives me a way of looking at it and sort of seeing the composition with fresher eyes. The same way sometimes I would take a painting, and if I'm not sure what exactly it needs, I'll go and hold it up in front of a mirror. And when you see it in reverse, you'll notice lots of things that you miss because you're seeing it with fresh eyes. I have here now another Uniball Signo pen. This is slightly different from the other one. If you've seen my videos in the past, I've talked about these, but there are two different Uniball Signos. This one that I've been using so far is the Angelic, and this one is the UM153. The UM153 is what I'm going to use now. It's more opaque than the Angelic, and it's got a slightly thicker line. So when I want more, when I want it to be very white, then this is the one I use. When I want to use the white as a little bit of blended highlighting or more subtle lines and subtle specks and dots, for example, you know, this stuff over here, then I'll use the Angelic. But when I'm using it more in almost a white paint capacity, then I'll use this UM153. Now I think some of the stuff is dry enough. I am going to bring in the edges of the rabbit, defining it more. Because right now it's sort of loosey-goosey. You know, I didn't really do anything to make it defined after that initial wash before with the India ink and splashing all over. So some of the areas are kind of wonky. What I'm talking about specifically is, you know, this hard edge, for example, and this hard edge and angle, and right here. And I've done a little bit to soften those up with the layers of watercolor ground earlier, the white watercolor ground. So because before those were really stark edges. Those were lines that were like this, you know. And I don't want that coming up next to my rabbit. I want him to have almost a glow to him. He's a moon rabbit after all. So he deserves a little bit of a glow. But now I'm at a stage where I want to define his form more. And he could still have that sense of a glow as long as I'm not too heavy-handed with how I bring in the surrounding areas. And same with these flowers, these blossoms. I want them also to have a glowing feel to them. So I think this is actually a little bit too dark. I think I'm going to have to choose a slightly lighter color or mixture of things. So I'm shifting to more, no, Buff Titanium is too light, so adding a tiny little bit of some of the neutral tones on my palette. just using some clean water on the brush to blend. And that blends things much nicer with the background. Now over here, the background area has more of a pinkish purple cast to it, so I've got to add a little bit of that to my mixture. And again, just running along the edges to soften the blending so that we get more of that glow effect. Part of that glow is making sure that my edges are not too harsh. So I don't want this clearly defined transition from rabbit to not rabbit. I want it more to be rabbit, blurry, ill-defined edge, and then not rabbit, you know? Edges are very important. Edges can really make a painting, and how you choose to define edges, whether you have sharply defined things or blurred or implied. More white fluffiness on that tail. I'm waiting for this little area to dry so I can do another layer. It's still sort of wet, so it's resisting my attempts to blend nicely. So while I'm waiting for that, let's move on to the texture of this foreground stone perch that he is on. A bit of shadowed area. Extending that shadow up into his body. Round two of trying to make this area more of a seamless blend. Still not quite there. It's probably going to take around 3 I got impatient and I went for it just now without really waiting for the previous layer to dry. Okay, meanwhile, let's move on to this flower, because that boundary also needs attention. A little bit more definition on these fuzzy rabbit paws. And darker bits of definition. Now I don't want to outline the entirety because that would erase that glow effect that I was talking about before. But the hindquarters are a safe bet for that because I want some shading anyway. And the paws. But I want to maintain that soft glow along these areas. Here I'm just doing the same kind of noodling around with my brush tip as I did on tree bark. And in fact, it is a very similar kind of texture, just different form and shape to it. This crackly rock base that the hair is seated on. Also need to ground these front paws a little bit. They look sort of like they're floating out there. So adding shadow into this region helps to give everything a nice base. And again, just like I did with the tree and the texture in the tree, I'm just working with the watermark textures and the granulation that happened over here, enhancing forms and shapes and turning the things that my mind sees into something that everyone can now see. Final little thing that needs to happen is the flowers need a little bit of shading and color. I want them, like the rabbit, to have this glow effect, but I also want them to have this rosy tone. So I've got a mixture of quinacridone gold and pink to add a little bit of shading. Now I'm making sure to run my brush parallel to the direction of the petals. As I do these brush strokes. I want a little bit more white over here. And same with these other two flowers. A bit of shading. Towards the center of the flower. Moving out towards whiter petal tips. So started with that pinkish tone and then wetting my brush and blending outwards. Then taking my gel pen. Sometimes I have to scribble a little bit to get the ink running. And defining the flower tips, petal tips, which got a little bit obscured in all the random texturizing that has happened over the course of this painting. And going back in and sculpting the shape of those petals a little bit more, because the gel pen is a blunt tool, literally. The tip is not very pointed and sharp. so you can't really get super fine with it. It's good for what it does, but brushes are always so much more versatile. So I still have to do this, which is giving more shape to these petals and adding a little bit of shadow as well. Bit of a pinkish, goldish wash over everything, blending and softening things. And one final flower over there to the left. I wanted to add just a little bit of a pinkish toned shadow on this paw, and instead it was really dark red. Well, not really dark, but it was pretty bright red there. I do not want it to look like a bloody paw. Okay, I think this piece is done. So here it is in its entirety. And here's the frame that it is intended to be fit into. And it's going to be sealed into this with resin eventually.